Welcome to our devotional study, Righteousness from the Heart. This study is based on Jesus' Beatitudes, those opening lines in the Sermon on the Mount. It's a passage that emphasizes what is involved in being right with God, and it makes it clear that we must give attention to both our attitude as well as our actions. In our last study, we gave attention to the first Beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit, a beatitude that emphasizes the need for humility in our approach to God. And we emphasize that this humility of heart and life is the foundation of righteousness from the heart. The second beatitude in Matthew chapter 5 and verse number 4 says, Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. And when Jesus spoke of those who mourn, he's not talking about sadness in general, but he's directing it in a specific way. He is directing it toward sin. Remember, the idea of blessed is being in a right relationship with God. And so the mourning that he speaks of has to do with sadness that is a result of sin. Mourning that comes to one who realizes that he is not right with God. We could also say that this mourning occurs in one who sees sin as it truly is, or perhaps a better way of putting it, who sees sin as God sees sin. In our last study, we considered the example of the Pharisee who went up to the temple to pray in Luke chapter 18. And even though he goes to the temple to pray, he's self-righteous. He lacks humility. And he does not see himself as he truly is. As a result, he did not see sin as it truly is. Here he is in the very place that represents the presence of God. But even there, he could not see himself as he really was. He could not see himself in relationship to God. If you remember, it was the tax collector who was able to do that. Do you remember his words? God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Now, if we do as this beatitude teaches, if we mourn in relation to sin, then we will see sin in contrast to the holiness of God. And anytime we see our sin against the backdrop of God's greatness and God's holiness, we should be saddened by our sin. We should, as the beatitude says, we should mourn. And you see an example of this in Isaiah. In Isaiah, the 6th chapter, he opens the chapter by describing the majesty and the greatness and the holiness of God. And then Isaiah looks at himself. Listen to him in Isaiah 6, beginning at verse number 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. Now listen to Isaiah as he contemplates himself against that backdrop. Verse number 5. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. When Isaiah saw himself against the backdrop of God's holiness, he had a different view of sin. And it was one that caused him to proclaim, Woe is me. You see Isaiah doing what this beatitude says to do. And if we're not careful, we will lose that understanding of sin. Sin has the ability to desensitize us. We can be so close to it that it really does not bother us. In addition, sin is progressive in nature. You see an example of this in the first Psalm. In fact, it's the first verse of the first psalm. And notice the progression. Now, the psalmist opens that psalm. He says, "Blessed is the man who does not." And now look at the things that he avoids. He does not walk in the way of the wicked. He does not stand in the way of sinners. And he does not sit in the seat of scoffers. Look at the progression in those words. He goes from walking to standing to then sitting, as each step gets him closer to those individuals who are opposed to God. And even though the English word doesn't give it as noticeably, the Hebrew words for those people that he avoids being around, the wicked, the sinners, and the scoffers, each of those words shows a progression into a deeper rebellion against God. And that's what sin does to us. It draws us in, and it takes us further and further away from God. And it can affect us to the point that we do not really see sin for what it really is, and see sin as God sees it. So think about the view of sin that we ought to have. And I think one of the first things we need to recognize about sin is that it alienates. It separates. From the very beginning, this has been the case. In Genesis, the 3rd chapter, we see how sin alienated man from God. God had given the command to Adam and Eve not to eat a particular fruit, but they ate of it. And once they did, their eyes were opened. They saw they were naked. They tried to clothe themselves. And then they heard God walking in the garden. And in Genesis 3, verse 8, the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. And here they are, trying to hide from God. And it's because of sin. And that chapter ends in verse 24 with God driving them out of the garden as a result of sin. Sin had alienated man from God and caused that separation. In the next chapter, you see that sin separates man from man, as Cain murders his brother Abel. And the Hebrew writer tells us, and John also tells us about Abel, that his works were righteous and Cain was evil. And that was done by sin. It was sin that caused that alienation between brothers. But sin even alienates a man from himself. In James chapter 1 and verse 8, James speaks about a double-minded man. Literally, the words there are a two-souled man. It's like two people living in the same body, and he is at odds with himself. And again, that's what sin does. Sin alienates, sin separates. But sin also grieves the heart of God. You think back to Genesis chapter 6 when God saw the wickedness of the earth was great, and he determined that he was going to destroy man from the face of the earth, and he sent the flood. Genesis 6 and verse number 6 says that God was grieved at the wickedness of man. Or think about the children of Israel who left Egypt, but because of their unbelief, they would not enter the land of Canaan. And God determined that they would wander in the wilderness until their bodies dropped, until they died. And for 40 years, they wandered the wilderness. In Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 8 speaks of God being grieved at what they had done. We often think about God's wrath when it comes to sin, and you see it in the bringing of the flood or in the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness, but it really goes much deeper than that. And the death of Jesus shows us the extent to which sin grieves the heart of God. And at the same time, it shows us the depth of his love for us. A terrible price had to be exacted because of sin, but God was willing to give his only begotten Son to pay that price. In Romans 5 and verse 8, the Bible says, "But God showed his love for us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." And when we have this understanding of sin, it should have a profound effect upon us. Sin has an allure because it promises pleasure. But when we realize that it also brings harm and pain, we are more likely to lay it aside. Now, if it hurts bad enough, you're going to stop doing it. But the beatitude before us, blessed are they that mourn, allows us to go in a bit deeper into the understanding of the true nature of sin. It occurs when we come to understand that sin doesn't just hurt us or those around us who love us, but sin hurts the heart of God. And when we come to see sin like that, then we will mourn because of what sin really does. The death of Jesus upon the cross reveals the extent of God's pain for our sin, and certainly should cause within us a mourning over our own sin. Let me illustrate this as we wrap the lesson up. Think about Simon Peter, the Apostle Peter. On the night that he was betrayed, Jesus told his apostles, "You will all forsake me." And of course, you probably remember that Peter said, "That's not going to happen. I'm not going to do that." And the Lord told him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And though Peter denied it would happen, of course it happened just like Jesus said it would. And I want you to listen to Luke's record of this. In Luke, the 22nd chapter, and in beginning about verse number 60, in Luke 22, beginning at verse number 60, this is right after another person had said to Peter, "Surely you were with him." And for the 3rd time, Peter denies knowing his Lord. After that, and immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." Now underscore these next words, for here you see a living and breathing example of the beatitude we're studying. Verse 62 says, "And he went out and wept bitterly." Sin had alienated Peter from his Lord. His denial that he knew Jesus had caused a separation, and because he saw the ugly effect of his sin, he is now on the road to having that fellowship with the Lord restored. And you can read the tender exchange between Jesus and Peter in John chapter 21, where Jesus comes to them on the seashore, and he has breakfast prepared, and then he and Peter go aside, and it's the account where Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me more than these?" And 3 times he raises the question, and you have that exchange between them. But that blessedness of being restored to fellowship with his Lord began when Peter mourned over his sin. James says a similar thing in James chapter 4, and beginning at verse number 8. Listen to what he says as he speaks about our sorrow for our sin and the blessedness that comes when we humble ourselves before the Lord. This is in James 4, beginning at verse number 8. He says, "Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you." In the words of James, you see the blessing of being right with God. And that's what righteousness from the heart is all about. I thank you for joining me for the study today, and I hope our time together has been of benefit to you. Please join me again next time as we continue our study of righteousness from the heart. And until then, may God richly bless your life.